Hey everyone, as Bailey mentioned, my name is Pooja and I'm the head of product at Protocol Labs. Super excited to be here today on the 1 year anniversary of Filecoin mainnet launch. It's amazing. So much has happened. I can't actually believe it's only been a year, but really, really excited to celebrate this incredibly important milestone with our amazing community. So today I'm going to talk about large data on Filecoin. And as Bailey mentioned, I'm going to just start by taking a step back and looking at what has really happened in the Filecoin network over the last year from a couple of different perspectives. So looking at some of the network growth. Then I'll talk about why Filecoin is a really great fit for large data sets, and then touch on some case studies of organizations that we've been working with to get their extremely important data sets onto Filecoin and some of the unique benefits that they've seen as they have been embarking on that journey. So first, taking a look at Filecoin by the numbers over the last year. So one thing that continues to impress me every single day is that Filecoin's reach really, truly is global. That we have more than 3,400 participants on the network that are storage providers that span locations across 45 countries across the world and hundreds of cities. And together, these more than 3,400 storage providers represent more than 15 exabytes of storage capacity, which is a truly mind-boggling number. I went back and looked at some of the talks that folks had given around Filecoin launch, and we were talking about how some of the very large cloud providers in the world are like getting to exabyte scale. And already the Filecoin network in just 1 year of existence has become truly one of the largest storage networks on the planet, which is so exciting and incredible. And this network is growing at a rate of 43 petabytes every single day. The other really interesting thing about Filecoin is that the market is hyper competitive when it comes to storage prices. The average cost of storage on the Filecoin network over the last 30 days looks like to pay for 1 terabyte of storage for 1 year on Filecoin costs less than $1. And if you compare this to maybe the nearest traditional competitors, maybe something like Amazon Glacier, which is more than 20 times the cost of storage on the Filecoin network. So really, really incredible to see the storage network itself and how it's grown. We also have a really incredible and expansive developer ecosystem. There are more than 7,500 contributors who are developers that are actively contributing to many different projects within the Filecoin ecosystem. There are more than 400 applications that have been built on the Filecoin stack, more than 100 venture-funded startups, and through some of the products that we've been building specifically for application developers, there are now literally more than 10,000 application developers that are building really inspiring new use cases and applications also on top of Filecoin using products like Web3.storage, NFT.storage, Estuary, and so on. And you can see here some of the logos of some of the partners that we work with, mostly within the Web3 space, but also some other institutions as well. And then, of course, one of the core reasons that Filecoin exists is to store humanity's most important data. And it's been really incredible to see, this is an area in which we really have seen so much growth that has been very inspiring for our team over the last year, because this is just so core to why we do what we do. But more than 600 organizations have been storing their data on Filecoin. And together, these organizations represent more than 200 petabytes of data that have either already actively been stored on the Filecoin network or are in planning phases for storage over the next several months. One other area that we recently started investing in as well, I'd say over like the last year or so, is in the NFT space. And over the last couple of months, we've seen more than 7 million NFTs that have been stored on the Filecoin network. So Filecoin, hopefully it's just a brief whirlwind through some of the numbers of what's happening on Filecoin, and hopefully that gives you a sense for the scale and just potential that this network really has. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about so what are some of the unique features and capabilities that make Filecoin a really good fit for large data in particular. As we all know, obviously cloud storage today is a critical part of our internet infrastructure. But we at Filecoin believe that there are some fundamental challenges with this infrastructure that, especially when we talk about storing humanity's most valuable data for decades and centuries, these challenges become really concerning. And we think that there are alternative solutions that can do a lot better. So what are some of these challenges? The first is that cloud storage is centralized. There are a handful of companies that many of us could recite, that's this very short list of who those companies are that control the vast majority of the cloud storage market. And because of this oligopolistic nature of the cloud storage market, a lot of these providers are able to make decisions that maybe, and policy decisions that are maybe in the best interest for their businesses, but maybe don't give the flexibility and control to their users that they would actually desire. One particular example of this is that, maybe as a cloud service, you're choosing to build and maintain data centers in locations where you're seeing the most activity, but that maybe isn't the best in terms of providing good service globally. But because all of these decisions are centralized in one individual company that has its own set of priorities, this may not be in the best interest of users, but it is the decision that gets made regardless. And so it can be really constraining for users. In addition, because most of these cloud storage companies have proprietary interfaces, it makes it really difficult for users to go and solve their own problems with protocol level innovation. So we think the centralization of this extremely critical infrastructure is a challenge. But in addition, we've also seen that cloud storage can be very brittle and very fragile. I think many of us have probably seen examples over the past several years where network instability can lead to data accessibility issues where you as a user maybe have stored something on a maybe unknowingly through an application that uses a particular cloud storage provider, and network level issues make your data now completely inaccessible. And these networks don't tend to have the level of self-healing and redundancy and resiliency that we think truly decentralized storage networks can have. So it's one element of fragility that we see in this type of infrastructure. And in addition, the cost of moving an organization's data to one of the cloud storage providers is also risky because it's so difficult to get the data back out that you're really concentrating your risk with whichever provider you've chosen. And you don't get to have, again, this sort of like de-risking of having multiple different providers that you as an organization are working with. And so that concentration of risk is something that we think is also very brittle. And then the last challenge here that we see is, we all probably know intuitively, and maybe some of us have seen the statistics about just the insane growth of data that is being generated every single day in our world. We are becoming so digital first, and it's just, projected to be several zettabytes of data that will be created over the next several years in our society. As we go more and more down this path, our digital and cloud and storage infrastructure cannot continue to be so expensive. And a lot of folks think that, oh, storage is a commodity, it's very cheap. But when we get to the sorts of scales that we talk about with very large data sets, this actually isn't true. And especially when we talk about data egress or retrieving data once it has been stored, that is especially not the case. We've actually spoken to a number of organizations that find the data egress costs from cloud storage so high that sometimes they just choose to abandon the data and just convert it from tape again or whatever, because they can't afford to pay the cost of data egress off of this infrastructure. So we think these are some of the challenges that are problematic as we want to build like centuries and millennia grade robust infrastructure for humanity's most valuable data. And this is what Filecoin sets out to do. It's to create a decentralized, efficient, and robust platform for humanity's data. Some of the ways that we do this are focusing in on the decentralized part, because Filecoin is this network of 3,400 plus storage providers, as I mentioned. There isn't the same notion of a single point of failure. You as an organization can choose to work with just one storage provider. You could choose to work with 10. You could choose to work with all 3,400 or more and growing. And that is an option that clients have on this network. The other thing as well, just given the way that Filecoin is built as this like open source first, like very open network, you as a user can, if there's any particular feature you want or anything that you think is really important that this network has, the fact that Filecoin is open source enables users to solve their own problems or to work with organizations to do this protocol level innovation and to solve these problems for themselves and also for other users on the network too. And the fact that it's open source enables that. Filecoin also is very robust. There are a number of mechanisms that have been really thoughtfully designed over several years to ensure that as an organization, if you're storing your data on Filecoin, you should have extremely high certainty and confidence that your data is going to be stored for the long term. We've innovated on a number of cryptographic mechanisms, different proofs. We have an extremely robust crypto economic model that had a truly inspiring amount of research and simulation and verification that went into it, and has proven to hold up over the last, at least the last year, and is projected to do very well for the foreseeable future. So, there are a number of like really, really thoughtful mechanisms that go into making sure that your data is properly stored and is going to be available and online whenever you need it. And then the last thing that's really compelling about the way that Filecoin designed is that it is a marketplace. And as we've seen in marketplaces in other industries, marketplaces enable efficiency in a number of different vectors. Of course, with pricing, which is why we've seen the price of storage on Filecoin so low, like more than 20x cheaper than the nearest alternative. But also it enables a lot more granularity and flexibility in terms of what you as an organization can choose as a potential storage solution. You don't get this just like black box, standard solution that everyone else gets. If you want to customize for your particular use case, you have that ability, and the efficiency and liquidity of storage types in the Filecoin market enables a lot more flexibility for users. All right. So those are some of the reasons why Filecoin, I think, is an extremely compelling solution for large data sets. And so I wanted to give some examples of how we've been working with organizations and why Filecoin has been really, really great for their particular use cases. So the first case study that I wanted to talk about was our work with the USC Shoah Foundation and Starling Lab. If you haven't already heard from Jonathan Doughton, who's the founding director of the Starling Lab, I'm sure he's giving one or many talks at Orbit. This is a really incredible use case, and he's a great speaker and is such a great storyteller. So I would highly recommend you go check out those talks. But the USC Shoah Foundation is a nonprofit organization that manages the world's largest archive of testimonies from genocide survivors. And the Starling Lab is an organization that's building a framework in collaboration with the Shoah Foundation and other groups, such as at Stanford. It's a framework for data integrity so that we, again, as we're moving to this increasingly digital first society, we can have really significant trust in our most critical digital records, and we don't have to feel like we're vulnerable to things like misinformation. This particular genocide testimonial archive is called the Visual History Archive, and it represents more than 8 petabytes of data of video testimonies from more than 55,000 genocide survivors around the world. You can see in this slide, it's more than 62 countries. These videos are recorded in more than 44 languages. And we're in process right now to get all of these archives onto the Filecoin network, and that is actively underway. So some of the core benefits that Filecoin has provided for this use case are that it has really leaned into this idea of Filecoin's cryptographic proofs and this being a actually publicly verifiable stamp that the data that is intending to be stored on Filecoin is properly stored and is safely available for the long term, and actually exposing these cryptographic proofs to users so that they themselves can go and verify, like, yes, is my data still stored on the network? And you can use these proofs to gain that confidence. Filecoin also leans into, just like the IPFS network, leans into content addressing data, which is essentially a way of referring to data by a fingerprint of the data itself, as opposed to just an arbitrary name. And this is, best practice in a lot of archival communities because it helps mitigate data tampering. You always know that if you're using the particular content identifier to look for a piece of data, that's what you're going to get, and you're not going to get some other data that had been tampered, some doctored in some way, but was named the same way as the original file, and getting this doctored version back. So the data integrity native features of Filecoin have been really beneficial here. The Filecoin blockchain is also a public record that includes information about who owns the data, what are these content identifiers, when was this data published, where is it stored, which geographies, with which individual storage providers, et cetera. And this, using the blockchain as this like public provenance record, has also been extremely valuable when we talk about this type of archival data set. And the last thing here is that we've seen there be a lot of value in the flexibility and configurability of the Filecoin network, because the Shoah Foundation and Starling Lab have had a lot of specific needs when it comes to which storage providers they feel comfortable working with, how they would like to encrypt their data before sending it, for example, or not, the number of copies they want to store on the network, and which geographies should have this data, which should not, et cetera. And so Filecoin enables all of those flexible choices, which has been extremely valuable in this case. And we have a quote here as well from Jonathan about the value of Filecoin for the Shoah Foundation. Another case study that I wanted to talk about is a really different sort of project, but there are 2 programs in particular. One is called Slingshot, and the other is called Filecoin Discover, both of which were started by Protocol Labs around a year ago. And so Slingshot is a community competition in which we are trying to mobilize, a massive community of folks who really care about preserving important data sets and work with them to collectively onboard this data onto the Filecoin network. And Filecoin Discover, it has a similar objective, but operates differently, where it's more like an open marketplace where storage providers can buy the data sets that they want to store and preserve on Filecoin. So between these two programs, we are storing more than 42 petabytes of data. And this is, already like actively in progress. Like this data has already been stored on Filecoin. It's really been amazing to see this happen. And some of the things that we have learned that Filecoin has been really successful at in this use case with public data sets is that we've seen, the fact that Filecoin is truly global has been a real advantage here, because we can store many, many copies of these data sets all over the world. And as you can see in this sort of Slingshot screenshot here, that some of these data sets are being stored in like more than 10 countries. And when you think about like community owned data and how we've all seen, I'm sure, for certain data sets, like local mirrors that communities will build because they want a copy of that data set closer to them. This is something that the Filecoin network just very naturally enables. And so it's, just makes the data much more highly available, much faster to access, and just much more resilient. If you have 10 copies versus one, much less likely that data is ever going to disappear from the internet. So global redundancy has been a big advantage here. The other interesting thing too is that because we've been working with this truly massive community of hundreds of community members that are working together to preserve these data sets, we've also developed this like massive library of documentation about how to interact with large data sets, store this data on Filecoin, how to get the data back out, and a bunch of tooling as well that has been built in order to make this sort of processing and onboarding of petabyte scale data really easy on Filecoin. So some really interesting use cases here as well that I'd encourage folks to look into. And then more recently, a recent project that we began working with, although we've been friends and partners in a number of different efforts with the Internet Archive for many years. But over the last few months, we've begun the long process, but very exciting process of onboarding all of the Internet Archive onto Filecoin. So if folks don't know, the Internet Archive is this really incredible nonprofit library of millions of free books, movies, software, websites. If folks are familiar with the Wayback Machine, that is the Internet Archive's work. And so in particular right now, what we're working with the Internet Archive on is to archive what's called the end of term web archive data set. And so what the Internet Archive does is basically at the end of every presidential term, they'll go through and crawl all of the government websites in the United States and take a snapshot of all of those websites. And then they do this at the end of every presidential term so that we can maintain this record of how does our government's view on what on its mission and what it does change from administration to administration. And so there are more than 60,000 websites that are part of this archive today that are currently in process of being onboarded to Filecoin. And then we're actively planning what does it look like to get the rest of like the 70 petabytes plus of the full Internet Archive on Filecoin as well. So some of the core advantages for this use case have really been leaning into the decentralized nature of the Filecoin network and just this belief that, when you think about, it's really amazing actually, like what very long-term archivists think about. But when we think about, protecting and preserving data for thousands of years, that really doesn't make sense, honestly, for it to be stored in just a few servers. It really needs to have a very robust infrastructure that has good mechanisms and resiliency and self-healing properties within it, so that this data, in the unforeseen circumstances that will happen over the next 1,000 years, can continue to live. So the decentralized nature of Filecoin and some of these like self-healing elements make Filecoin a very compelling choice for this data. The fact that the way that Filecoin is designed is really intent to persist data for the long term is also very compelling here. And this is a little bit more tactical, but there's so much flexibility in the types of tooling that can be used to bring this data onto Filecoin. It's not this like very strict, very prescriptive pathway for the organization. So they can really choose bits and pieces of tooling that are going to make this a very easy on-ramp for them. And so that's one of the things that has made this also a much easier onboarding process than maybe it would have been otherwise. And then the last one I'll just really quickly touch on is a recent partnership that we have been working on with the Columbia University and Max Planck Institute. And they're building a new data sharing solution for climate data sets. So the use case here is that, a number of researchers across different organizations generate data. They'd like to all contribute this data to a sort of like shared pool so that they can then do analyses on the data that they generated, but also on data that's coming from other researchers. And so it's sort of this like use case of research collaboration. And the plan here is to onboard, more than 1.5 petabytes of climate data sets, so that more than 40 research institutions can participate in sort of this like shared pool and research collaboration project. So some of the advantages of Filecoin here have been that this notion of like there really is just natively this unified access layer. Once the data is on the Filecoin network, any researcher from any organization should be able to access this data via the same layer. There's no special permissioning or anything that's required. The open nature of Filecoin enables this. And so that's one thing that's been compelling here. The fact that Filecoin is hyper competitive, and actually in this case, I know I mentioned average costs are something like less than $1 per terabyte per year, but so far all of the data in this case has actually been stored at zero cost. And so most of the costs here have been in data processing and transfer, which is the case for any sort of data migration and onboarding project. And so the fact that Filecoin, especially for research institutions that are not like corporations that can afford to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in storage, this is like a really compelling feature. And then, of course, the fact that Filecoin and IPFS natively interoperate has also been compelling here because we want to be able to leverage the extremely broad IPFS network to as a distribution layer for this scientific data. So, we've, as Filecoin has been evolving over the last year, we've started to get some more nods and sort of like just reports on, the fact that Filecoin actually really is a solution that is appropriate for high SLA data services for large data sets. And so there's some quotes here from some of our friends at GigaOM. But it really, the main thing I want to impress is that these are just a few examples, but Filecoin has really been built to store large data sets, and we've seen some initial examples of this, and just can't wait for more organizations to come forth and say that, hey, we think this is the right way to think about long-term storage of our most valuable data, and we want to explore what this looks like. So we think Filecoin can support so many use cases, and are really excited that we've had some initial successes here that can start to be the foundation for more use cases down the road. So yes, I just wanted to say, get in touch. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. If you want to talk to us about storing your large data, please reach out on email or Slack. We'd love to talk to you and see how we can support your organization.